Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venn.
I started out as a criminal defense lawyer, and I was interested in criminal law because it deals with very fundamental questions. In international organizations, human rights are much more part of the conversation. In East Timor, I was working with the United Nations for an international hybrid tribunal dealing with war crimes. There can be economic benefit, and you also shouldn't underestimate the risks to the reputation of a company which may arise from human rights breaches.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today, I have Holger Hembach, who's a lawyer and focuses on sustainability. Welcome, Holger.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So, Holger, maybe we start with looking first at your history to make sure everybody understands your background and where you're coming from and why we talk today. So you have really traveled the world and brought, as an attorney, guidance to many different projects for OSCE, GIZ, and the United Nations, especially in East Timor. What were some of the most interesting projects you worked with these big organizations together? And maybe talk about the top three.
Well, first I would like to mention is actually my stay in East Timor. I was working with the United Nations for an international hybrid tribunal dealing with war crimes which had been committed during the fight for freedom against Indonesia. And it was interesting because it was my first time so far from home, and was interesting for me to work in an international environment with colleagues from many different countries in a very interesting area of law, namely international criminal law. The second would be my time as an advisor to the African Court on Human and People Rights. That was in 2013, and at that time the African Court for Human and People's Rights was still at a very nascent stage. It had been established a couple of years before, but for a long time it more or less existed only on paper. And the time when I joined the court as an advisor was the time when the court really started functioning and took in the first cases. So it was interesting to work in a novel area of law and to get an insight into the African human rights system. And the third thing I would like to mention was working with the OSCE in North Macedonia. I was working on projects fostering the rule of law and human rights. And I conducted a series of trainings on the European Convention on Human Rights for a variety of lawyers in North Macedonia. And it was interesting to exchange views with colleagues from a different jurisdiction to capture their views on many things and to exchange experiences and knowledge.
Yeah. So looking back at that time, right, now you're very active in the area of sustainability, human rights. You actually founded your own business as a legal advisor centered around human rights and in an economic context. So how did you develop that passion, and has it to do with all this experience from your foreign travels, essentially?
Yes, definitely. That's how it developed. I started out as a criminal defense lawyer, and I was interested in criminal law because it deals with very fundamental questions, responsibility, guilt, innocence. So that already touched upon issues of fundamental rights, but in German legal education, human rights do not really play a role. So I had not had much contact with human rights before. And that changed when I started working in international environment, because in international organizations, human rights are much more part of the conversation than in the domestic jurisdiction. When you start working with colleagues from different countries, then you start discussing what's really the international standards, because you have colleagues from Nigeria or the Netherlands and Germany, and everybody says, in our home jurisdiction, we do it like that. And somebody else says, but in our home jurisdiction, we do it like that. And then if you want to find a common ground and to see what's the best way to approach a matter, what should be internationally accepted, then that gets back to human rights. So I started getting interested in human rights law, reading up on that, and I decided to work more in that field, which is why I stayed for some 10 years working with international organizations. And during that time, I really developed my preference or my liking for international human rights law.
Okay, that's very interesting. Why? And I really don't know. So because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert. So why are human rights not a big focus in, for example, studying in Germany or generally in the German jurisdiction system?
First of all, I must say that this might have changed in the meantime. So when I studied in the 90s, at that time it was like that, and the legal education was very much focused on preparing future judges, future prosecutors, future attorneys for their work in German courts. Mm-hmm. And in German courts, German law is applied. So that was the focus of the legal education. And all those international things were not considered very important, maybe at some stage not taken very seriously either. So that was not something which was a focus of legal education. But as I've said, this may have changed in the meantime.
Yeah, it's still interesting because essentially, right, I do believe fundamentally human rights are the basis of the German system, I would say, right? I mean, it's the way everything came together and how the international players helped shape the German legal system after the war. I think the human rights are a fundamental part of what, at least I thought that the human rights are fundamental to our law system, actually. Yeah.
Yes, and that's for some people a point of criticism, that they say that fundamental things and that German legal education is focused too much on dealing with tiny details of specific provisions, and that people don't understand enough of the historic background, of the philosophy behind it, or of fundamental principles.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. See, I learned something. That's always good. I love that. Okay, so now you have started in 2015 your own firm, and you got involved a lot with the European Union, especially in Moldova. You advised on integrity and corruption, which are very important topics also for global supply chains, because they deal with a lot of different countries, and especially also countries where corruption might be a thing and you need to be careful. What are some of the most fundamental things supply chain leaders should do to improve their resilience against corruptions? I assume you're a perfect person to ask that, because you probably advised exactly on things like that from a government perspective as well.
That's correct. And from a government perspective, I think, first of all, it's important to have a clear policy established so that it becomes clear from the leadership. We do not condone that, and we do not want to have business which is brought in using corruption, basically tone from the top. That's the key word which is often used in that connection. I think it's important to establish mechanisms which aim at identifying cases of corruption. Whistleblower hotline can be a part of that. This can also be done by random checks, by some sort of reporting system. So you have to have effective mechanisms to control, and you have to enforce them. So it must be clear that corruption is not accepted, and that cases of corruption will actually have consequences, so that people know they cannot get away with it. And I think it's important to have a policy which makes clear that you're willing to say no to business. That you say, okay, we forfeit this profit which we could make using this business because we can only gain it by using corruption, and we don't want that, and we rather stay clean and not make a profit than trying to harbor that business as well. These are the most important points in my opinion.
Yeah. I think the last one is sometimes a tough call, right? Especially if you're under pressure to deliver results.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. No, I can, but yeah. I think the most important thing here is to do regular checks and then operationalize the auditing of your polices for corruption or whatever. And I think that's something that still can be improved. But we have to improve it because of the new laws that are coming up. And one of them that has been established is a German supply chain law, which is also called Lieferkettengesetz, which a lot of people from the US love to say because it's a long word. So you focus on providing advisory around the LkSG. What, in your view, after having talked to a lot of companies about this, were some of the negative things that came with the German supply chain law, and what were some very positive things? And also what might have been things you expected to happen that haven't really materialized?
To start with the positive things, I think the most positive effect is that German companies have actually started thinking about human rights in their supply chain. So far, that was more or less an afterthought, if at all. And now many companies really starting dealing with the issue and trying to establish expertise, trying to think about it, trying to adapt their procedures, their processes. So that's something which has come on the radar of companies. And before that, that was not the case. I think one of the negative aspects is that many companies perceive it as a sort of bureaucracy imposed on them, and that they are not really willing to deal with the issue, but that they think they take a very formalistic approach, and I think they just have to do what's necessary to be on the safe side, to be compliant so that they cannot be sanctioned, but they don't really think about the spirit of the law, that it's really about improving human rights, but they rather focus on what can we do to avoid sanctions, what's the bare minimum with which we can get away, more or less. So that's, and that additional need for administrative resources has led some companies to reject the very idea that they should deal with human rights in their supply chains. They think, my God, that's a lot of work, that's a lot of bureaucracy, we shouldn't be dealing with that. States should focus on that, so they reject the entire idea. And what has so far not materialized is, in my opinion, and that may be too harsh, but like large-scale improvements in many areas, really tangible results. I think there are companies which are really dealing with things, and there's progress in some areas, so you can see positive effects, but it hasn't had the punch many people had expected. But this may also be because it's still too early to say.
Yeah. I personally think that a lot of companies are doing themselves misfavor in just using it as a cover-up solution and doing the bare minimum. Because I think the fundamental intention behind it is not only implementing human rights in supply chains, but also creating a level playing fields for companies. Because obviously in Europe, you hopefully don't have to put a gun on somebody's head and ask him to put the pieces together free of charge, right? I mean, something we hopefully don't do. I mean, if we maybe something comes up, right? The police investigate something and find something really devastating, and then I'm the fool. But generally, I think this is a rather a place, for example, where it works very well, same with America. And then there are other places in the world where maybe there's a little bit more force involved in getting people to work and maybe not getting a fair wage. And as a company being in places where this is not the case, it's hard to compete, frankly, right? I mean, your production costs are just higher because you pay them fair.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's something that's very overlooked because it directly brings a benefit to you as a company to do that. And because you create a level playing field by enforcing human rights, and you can maybe don't have to move your production somewhere else because now it's fair. Yeah. So I think it's not only about human rights, which obviously it's always good that they are enforced, but there's also economic benefit to it. I'm not sure if you have an opinion on that.
Definitely. There can be economic benefit, and you also shouldn't underestimate the risks for the reputation of a company which may arise from human rights breaches. And the more people are thinking about that, the more media are reporting about it, the higher the pressure on companies to be actually compliant. So if they don't do it for the sake of human rights, they should also comply with human rights laws in the interest of their own bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. So now let's look at something around the German supply chain law that was, I would say, somewhat surprising because the reporting, these 100, how many are there? 144 questions. The reporting was shifted now 2 times, delayed, always right before it should have been submitted. Do you think that was a wise move or not, and why?
I don't think it was a wise move. First of all, because it punishes basically companies which have been compliant and which have been far in their preparations to submit this report. And companies which have been lackluster now have an advantage. They can say, okay, that was smart of us not to comply on time because we have been given an extension of the deadline. I don't think that it really alleviates the burden on companies because the reporting is not the main part of the bureaucracy or the administrative effort combined with the supply chain law. Companies still have to document everything they do. They still have to comply with the law. And I think the documentation is much more cumbersome and takes much more effort than the actual reporting. And once the documentation is right, the reporting is not that much of an effort. So they weren't really saved a lot, or the companies didn't really save a lot of bureaucracy by not having to report. But the enforcement by the BAFA, the authority which is in charge of supervising and enforcing observance with the LkSG, has been weakened because for the BAFA, the reporting is an important tool to make sure to check whether or not companies comply with the law. And they are in a difficult situation now because they cannot rely on these reports for their checks. So the enforcement of the law has been weakened. It hasn't done much good for the companies, and it has rewarded companies which were lackluster in complying with the law.
Yeah. But do you have any idea why they might have shifted the reporting? Is it because they wouldn't have been able to check it? Do they not have enough manpower, or what could it be?
I think there was a growing political pressure and a growing pressure from the side of business associations, which were complaining about too much bureaucracy. All of a sudden, that became a thing. This term bureaucracy monster was invented in regard to the LkSG, but also to the CSDDD. And politicians had the feeling they needed to react. They had to do something and to present some sort of result and see to be able to tell the business society, we are hearing you, we are reacting to your concerns, we are willing to give you some slack. And that was, in my opinion, more or less a token measure to appease the business community.
Yeah. Although most of the work probably has already been done by a lot of companies. Yeah, it is what it is. Okay, you already talked about it, so let's directly move over to that. So we now have a new regulation coming up, the CSDDD, that is also called a bureaucracy monster. Maybe let's talk about that a little bit. So what is your take on the differences between both laws? And do you think that CSDDD is also the bureaucracy monster that is said to be? And also, will it have a bigger impact than LkSG in the long run?
So the CSDDD is in some respects more demanding than the LkSG, and in some respects lags behind the LkSG. So the CSDDD doesn't apply to all that many companies as the LkSG. You don't have a threshold only of the number of employees, but also a threshold regarding revenue, which means that not that many or that less companies will be in scope of the LkSG. On the other hand, the CSDDD imposes further reaching obligations on companies. They have to scrutinize the supply chain, the entire upstream supply chain and certain parts of the downstream supply chain. They have to take more rights and environmental standards into consideration when they scrutinize the supply chain. So the scope of the obligations goes further. And also there is civil liability, which is not enshrined in the LkSG. So in that respect, CSDDD goes beyond the LkSG. But at the same time, the European legislator has tried to avoid or try to learn from some lessons of the LkSG. And one thing is that they want to make sure that companies take a risk-based approach, that they don't scrutinize all the suppliers in the same way, but they really focus on risky areas, which is to alleviate the burden on them, to make it less difficult to comply with the law. So in some points, the European legislator has reacted to what it perceived as deficiencies or shortcomings of the LkSG, and to adapt the law accordingly. I think it's a good thing that the playing field across Europe will be more level. So it won't be a competitive advantage for an Italian company that it relies or that it does not have to scrutinize its supply chains, that they can rely on child labor in the supply chain, while German companies which are in scope of the LkSG have to take measures. So the playing field will be more level. And I think that the impact of the entire law will be stronger because there's more purchasing power involved. So far, certain suppliers have difficulties in supplying to German companies because German companies say, we cannot buy from you under those conditions. You have to improve your standards. You have to do this. You have to do that. And so far, those companies still had the possibility, the supplier had still the possibility to find clients in other European countries. They could still say, okay, then I don't sell to the German company, but I sell to the Spanish company, I sell to the French company. And this will be out. So the pressure on suppliers to comply with certain standards will be bigger. And I think this will improve the impact or enlarge the impact of the regulation on the regulation, the directive.
Yeah. So in that vein, we now have a lot of different regulations on this planet, from the US with UFLPA, Norway has an own law, Canada made an own law, Germany has one, and there are a lot of others, Australia, you name it. Now CSDDD also comes up, and you already said it's going to be more effective than the German supply chain law overall. But which one of all of those laws do you deem the most effective one right now, based on the way it's executed?
I'm a bit torn between the German Supply Chain Act and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act effectively prevents companies from importing goods into the United States, which have been manufactured by companies which have certain ties to forced labor in the Xinjiang region of China. And that really has the potential to affect the bottom line of companies. So they cannot import it into the US, they cannot sell their goods in the US. And that's, of course, a huge incentive to really think about their supply chains very carefully and scrutinize them very carefully. And I think that this economic pressure on a company can be a very effective tool to ensure compliance. And that's maybe better than all those appeals. You should really respect human rights, which have proven ineffective. And that's a strong point in favor of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. On the other hand, the German supply chain law is much more comprehensive. It does not focus on forced labor only, but on many other human rights violations. And it forces companies to take a much more holistic approach to scrutinizing their supply chain. And I think that's a strong argument in favor of the German Supply Chain Act. So I'm a bit torn between those two.
Yeah. I mean, the UFLPA is enforced by the customs of the border patrol, Customs and Border Patrol, and I think they have seized by now 4 trillion shipments worth $4 trillion, which is a massive amount. So I think the execution is very good on this law, the way that customs is enforcing it. So it directly it does something. I think with the German law, I think we're the policy is great, but the enforcement still is lagging a bit, right? That's why my personal preference is UFLPA right now. But again, it more gets a fundamental basic human right out of the way, and it doesn't really improve the situation, right? It just says not from there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally get the point. Good. So you have a outside view on supply chains a little bit, being a lawyer, but you're very focused on ESG and sustainability. So do you think that with the outside view that the supply chain can be a sustainable and a supply chain can be a differentiating factor for companies, or will it end up just being, okay, we have to do this, let's fulfill the minimum requirements going forward?
I think that this whole topic of ESG and sustainability is not going away. It will be stronger, will become stronger over the years, and the pressure on companies to take those things into consideration will increase. And I think in the long run, the more consumers are willing to adjust their decisions on which goods to consume, which articles to buy, on sustainability aspects as well, will increase the pressure on companies to look at their supply chain, to be compliant, to be sustainable. So I think in the long run, it will be differentiating factor. I think that's not as strong right now as I'd expected, because in many cases, consumers seem to be good at requesting certain standards and to be good at processing, but they're not willing yet to make the decision accordingly. So when it comes to the actual buying decision, and not many consumers are willing to say, okay, I'm willing to pay 20 cents more for this chocolate because I'm very sure it has not been manufactured using child labor. But I think that the number of consumers who are willing to do that will increase in the long run. And I think that companies are well advised to think about sustainability into supply chains to be competitive in the long run.
And while I think it's not going fast enough that people put their money where their mouth is, I do believe there is also subtle change happening every now and then, which I personally can appreciate. I don't know if you read this, but for example, the big discounters in Germany, Aldi and Lidl, have now banned milk from the worst standards out of their grocery stores because they say consumers are not willing to buy that anymore. And I think that's a positive sign. That's a start.
No, definitely. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a start for sure. So we're getting somewhere slowly but surely. Okay, I have one more question that is around supply chains, because you started first being a lawyer, then working in international environments, getting to know human rights, and then with your firm, you started really looking at supply chains and businesses in general. So what has been your perception of supply chains in the past, and how has it developed while working on things like the LkSG?
I had no concept how complex and complicated all of that is. So I hadn't known how many suppliers many companies have, of how many small parts some products comprise. So that has developed substantially, and I had known that it's that complicated, and also appreciate how difficult it may be for some companies to get an overview over the supply chains, to check most of their suppliers regarding certain standards, and I hadn't been aware of that.
Yeah, I think we need to boost that awareness, and that's why we do podcasts like this. Okay, so last question. Dealing with things like human rights and enforcing human rights, that can also sometimes be frustrating, frankly, because obviously in economics, you always have to make this money versus do I invest in human rights kind of trade-off as a company, which I think is fair because that's the society we live in, and that's also fine. But that can be frustrating for somebody that's as passionate about it as you are. So what do you do as a hobby in order to let off a little bit of steam every once in a while?
I go running and I go to the gym from time to time. It's not very original, but I like it. I enjoy it, and it helps me to let some steam off.
Yeah. And are you really a passionate runner? Are you trying to sometimes partake in some running activities against time? Are you measuring yourself?
No, not at all. Not at all. I always run the same distance. I'm not trying to improve. I'm not improving, let's say it like that. I'm not ambitious about it. Just to go for a run every now and then.
Okay. It's good. I love that, actually. It's I think being content is also an art, essentially. So Holger, many thanks for doing this. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
For all the listeners out there, I'm going to end this really shortly because we're running a little bit over time. For all the listeners out there, thank you so much for listening. Also, thank you so much for watching. If you're on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Anyway, wish everybody a nice day. And with that, we say bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talk Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.